Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 123. Game Plan. As Hizashi brought the kid some tea, Shota lost himself in his thoughts again. He had already had a Venn diagram in his mind comparing Ivy and Midoriya. There was a lot of overlap, but as he continued to try and squish the two circles into one, the more stray parts fell out. Assumptions that he had made about either of them that didn't fit anymore now that he had the full picture. Age, for one, was certainly the most jarring revelation. Midoriya was too young to know the things he knew or make the jokes he made. He was too smart for his own good. That was another thing he was coming to terms with. Ivy never had an intelligence quirk or an agility quirk. They hardly ever used their quirk, if at all, while on patrol, which made sense. It was too distinctive and in most cases too powerful to be used against another human being. He was horrified and impressed in equal measure. It seemed that there was very little that Midoriya wasn't capable of. That kid was absolutely brilliant, and Shota had to protect him. He had to make sure that he would be allowed to live up to his incredible potential, but he couldn't do that alone. He didn't have the authority to shut down or seal Ivy's case file, and he didn't have the reach to make sure that any of the crimes Midoriya may or may not have committed never made their way back to him. Nedzu knew how to hunt things down. He knew how to find the barest scraps of paper trails and connect seemingly unrelated bits of evidence into a concrete case. If anyone was capable of completely eradicating any proof of wrongdoing on Midoriya's part, it would be him. As for the case itself, well, Tsukauchi was still the lead detective on it. He had only been adding things to the file that he couldn't not add. Things like other officers' reports or witness statements. He had been making it difficult to pin down whether or not Ivy was involved in any incidents. So, on paper, Ivy was not very active, which was good, but not good enough. They needed to figure out a way for the case to be closed. They needed to ensure that, should the case ever be passed on to someone else's plate, they wouldn't go poking their nose into it and uncover anything Nedzu wasn't able to fully erase. Of course, that was all under the assumption that those two were willing to put their own careers on the line in order to save this kid. He knew Tsukauchi cared about Ivy. He only called Shota in on the case in the first place because he cared about Ivy. But he didn't know whether he cared enough to risk everything. He also knew that Nedzu cared about Midoriya. He cared about all of his students. He had asked Shota about Midoriya's well-being specifically several times after the USJ incident, but he didn't know if the stoat would risk his job for one kid. Nedzu was a hero, an unconventional one, but a hero nonetheless. He was dedicated to saving people. But if he lost his title trying to save Midoriya, he wouldn't be able to save anyone again. He may not be so forthcoming with his emotions, but Shota knew he had a fierce sense of protectiveness for his students. Whether or not that sense outweighed his logical side was a gamble, but one that Shota had to make, whether he liked it or not. They already had a meeting set for 6 p.m. tonight, and there was no getting out of it, save for fleeing the country, perhaps. But this was Nedzu. There likely wasn't a corner of the globe that they could run to where he couldn't find them. This was the only option. He just had to hope to Kami that it worked. Aizawa, UA Conference Room B, 6 p.m. Urgent. Well, that wasn't a text he was expecting, nor one that he wanted. Tsukauchi, what do you mean by urgent? Aizawa, not a matter of life and death, but time sensitive. He figured that was all the elaboration he was going to get, but it was better than nothing. It quelled his anxiety slightly. If it had something to do with the League of Villain case, he would have been contacted by Nedzu, so it was probably something else, which wasn't great, but it wasn't a matter of life and death. Urgent, but not life or death. What the hell could it be? He had been woken up by the text, and he had a feeling he wasn't going to get back to sleep now. He had thought working the night shift was bad, but working half-night shifts and half-day shifts was so much worse. He had been working under the chief detective, training in order to take his place when he retired in a few months. But working half his old hours and half new hours had him wondering whether or not it was worth it. He rolled back over with a groan, shut his eyes, and hoped for the best. Hizashi had been nervously puttering about the apartment, mindlessly tidying nothing in particular while trying to distract himself from his thoughts. Midoriya was dead on his feet. They'd needed to help him into bed because his legs gave out when he tried to stand up, so they had to assume he was asleep by now. He felt like he hadn't had a second to sort through his thoughts when, in all reality, they had been doing little else since the moment Sho had told him last night. He was standing motionless in the kitchen, holding a broom and trying his best to make sense of it all. 12. He was only 12. How could someone abandon their son like that? How did a 12-year-old survive on the streets for 4 years? How was this kid still alive? What had he had to endure in order for him to still be standing here today? How was he still so kind? How had his life not hardened him into something cruel? He had felt a connection with the kids since day one. He always started out his classes with some sort of joke in English, and it was rare that anyone ever picked up on it. He couldn't get the kid out of his mind since the USJ. They'd been worried sick about him, wondering how he was coping with everything on his own. He had been hoping that the parent-teacher conference would have settled his anxieties, but clearly that wasn't going to happen. 4 years. 4 freaking years. They felt tears slide down their cheeks as they stared at the cabinet with unfocused eyes. They remembered all the times that Shota had come home from patrol and gotten into bed as tense as a board. They remembered all the times that they had told him that Ivy was more competent than he gave them credit for. They remembered all the times they had told him to have faith in them. They were such an idiot. Would it have been a catastrophe for Uptown if they had taken Ivy out of those streets? Yes. Yes, it would. Midoriya would have probably hated them forever, but at least he would have been safe. He was just a kid. He was just a little kid. Their hand tightened around the broom handle and they shifted their grip so their palm was face down on the end of it before they rested their head on the back of their hand. He was just a little kid. He brought his other hand up to cover his mouth as he began to cry in earnest. He was just a little kid. Shota had gone out to get groceries and was due back any minute. They needed to pull themselves together. He knew how much Sho hated to see him cry, and they couldn't both be having a breakdown. What if Midoriya needed them? They took a few shaky breaths and went back to sweeping up nothing and did their best to remind themselves that things were going to get better. Midoriya was safe now, and things were going to get better. Evening, Nedzu. Aizawa. Naomasa greeted with a small bow. Good evening, Detective. Nedzu greeted in return. Aizawa remained silent. He looked more tired than Naomasa had ever seen him. His normally expressionless face was sporting a frown which, in terms of the expressions he'd seen him make before, was pretty intense. Nedzu's face betrayed nothing, but he wasn't sure if that was just his own inability to read him or if there was genuinely nothing to read. So, to what do I owe the pleasure? he asked Nedzu as he took his seat across from Aizawa. I'm not entirely sure, Detective. Aizawa requested you specifically for a case involving one of our students. Now that you're here, I'm sure he can fill us both in. Aizawa took a deep breath and let out a sigh as he ran his hand through his tangled hair before he spoke. Midoriya Izuku, he said as he slid a file across the table toward him. Tsukauchi shot a glance toward Nedzu again, but his expression betrayed nothing. Was this about One for All? Had Aizawa caught on? He was a smart man. Now Masa wouldn't doubt it, but he wasn't about to give anything away. The one who got sent to the hospital after the USJ, right? What about him? He asked, feigning ignorance. Aizawa pursed his lips and shot a glance between the two of them. He had never seen the man so nervous, and it was making him uncomfortable. What I am about to say is to remain off record as much as it can, he said hesitantly before he went any further. Well, at least if this was about One for All, maybe Aizawa knew how important it was to keep it to himself. I cannot promise you anything if I don't know what we're talking about, but I will say that our students' safety takes precedence over all else, including the law, Nedzu replied cautiously. That seemed to soothe Aizawa's worry slightly, and the nod of agreement Naomasa added had his shoulders relaxing even more. All right. Good. Okay. Aizawa conceded before continuing. He turned to Nedzu as he spoke. I have been working with a vigilante for over the past 2 years during my patrols on the north side of Mustafa. They go by the name Ivy. Tsukauchi's higher-ups wanted the vigilante taken down, but they were doing good work, helping people in places we couldn't reach. So he asked me to keep an eye on them, make sure they didn't get themselves killed, and we've been working as partners ever since, he explained. Now Masa turned his gaze toward Nedzu to gauge his reaction. He was surprised Aizawa would compromise Ivy like this, but again, the creature's face betrayed no sort of reaction. We were patrolling last night, like normal, and Aizawa trailed off. That sent a spike of anxiety through his chest. Ivy being taken out of commission would surely be enough to make Aizawa look that tired. He remembered what he was like when the kid went MIA that one night last fall. He would have been informed sooner than this if Ivy had been hurt, right? Aizawa, are they okay? He couldn't help but ask. They're fine. Well, What exactly does all of this have to do with finding one of our students living on the streets? Nedzu interrupted with a sharp flick of his tail. He was getting impatient. Wait, finding what? Now Masa had forgotten what they were meeting about to begin with. He had forgotten about the file in his hands. He was starting to slot pieces together that he desperately hoped didn't belong there. Midoriya is Ivy, Aizawa responded curtly. Naomasa froze, with his jaw agape, and waited for Aizawa to take back the words. He didn't. He just sat in his chair and looked back and forth between the two of them. He can't. I thought Midoriya, he's only 15, isn't he? Naomasa asked dumbly. The silence was becoming deafening. Yes, he is, Aizawa responded coolly. Naomasa looked over to the principal to try and glean any sort of information about how he was taking this, but again, nothing. His attention was brought back to Aizawa when he started to speak. I don't want this on his record, permanent or otherwise. It would ruin his career. It would ruin his life. Aizawa was cut off by a raised paw. Nedzu finally returned his gaze, but it didn't answer any of his questions. He lowered his paw back down to the desk, and the three of them sat in tense silence. Well, that certainly explains his rather advanced skill set, Nedzu finally replied. Now it was Aizawa's turn to exchange a nervous glance with him. Nedzu didn't have the first idea about what all that kid had done as Ivy. I agree, Aizawa. Having this go on to Midoriya's record would be an incredible waste of potential, he added as he looked back at Naomasa, prompting him with a nod. He was confused for a moment before he realized what he was asking, but in his defense, his mind had just been blown to bits. Yes, I don't want that. Yes, I agree, he replied hastily once he figured out what was being asked of him. Aizawa actually let out a sigh of relief at his response. So, what do we do? Naomasa asked. I mean, did you bring us here with a plan? Yes, that's the $1,000,000 question, Nedzu chirped, turning his attention to Aizawa. We need to find a way to write off Ivy on paper, and we need to start an investigation into Midoriya's parents. I was hoping you two could handle the Ivy situation. He's already the lead on Ivy's case. He nodded toward Naomasa before turning to Nedzu, and we need you to make sure there's absolutely no trail that could lead back to Midoriya. And Midoriya's case? Naomasa asked nervously, sparing a glance toward Nedzu again. Midoriya's case was not something he wanted just anyone poking their nose into. There was too much to be found there, and the right detective with the wrong motivations could make this situation so much worse for everyone involved. I would like to handle it, if possible. Aizawa answered, there's too much to hide, and I don't want someone uncovering things that you two are covering. I already know the situation, and I know what to keep off the record. The room fell quiet after that, and Naomasa took that time to try and iron out his brain. That was a good idea, but Aizawa didn't even know the whole story of what was already being covered up on Midoriya's file. There was no way this investigation was going to conclude without Aizawa finding out about One for All, but he supposed there were worse outcomes. Aizawa cared about the kid. He wouldn't do anything to put him in danger, even if he did find out the whole truth. He knew that Aizawa was likely looking for an answer from him, but he just needed a minute. He would have been 12 when he started. No wonder people were reporting that a child had taken them down. They were a child, an honest to God child, not even a teen yet. Shame. And they had let him run around out there for years. He was just a little kid, a homeless, workless little kid. How in the world? And now he has all the baggage of One for All on his shoulders, along with potentially All for One, still a lingering threat. This poor kid was in such deep shit. Detective. Nedzu's voice cut through his thoughts. Yes, sir. Sorry, I was. What was the question? If we go on record here to report the abandonment case to you, would you be able to ensure Aizawa can take the lead on it? Nedzu asked, presumably for the second time. I should. Well, I can at least get him on the case. I have to assign an officer to it, though. I could keep it on my docket in an official capacity and have you do all the actual work on it, but I won't be able to help much with everything on my plate at the moment. That's fine, Aizawa answered readily. Wait, if he found the kid last night, where was he? This had gone unreported for at least 18 hours now, right? Oh, Aizawa, don't tell me you didn't, he pleaded in his head before he asked the question he almost certainly knew the answer to. Where is he now? Midoriya. Where is he? He's at home with Hizashi. Aizawa answered as expected. Great. Aizawa, that's kidnapping, he pointed out after taking a deep breath. What the hell was I supposed to do? Turn him in? He shot back. Yeah, okay, just that's not going on record either, he said as he massaged his temples. Okay, come into the station, say 11 p.m., and report this to me. Say you just found him tonight and you did not have him illegally stowed away in your apartment for 24 hours, and we'll figure it out from there. You want me to come in with the kid? Aizawa asked. Yes, it's still kidnapping if you claimed to have taken him home before reporting it. What will happen with him? Will I be able to take him home afterward? He asked, a subtle air of desperation in his tone. Oh, shoot. Of course, he wasn't going to want to let the kid out of his sight. He did his best to soften his voice without sounding patronizing before he answered, It will probably be a long night. We will need to assign a social worker to his case, and he will be put into the foster system. So I don't think you will. I have a foster license. Aizawa cut him off. You what? He asked rhetorically. On the hierarchy of mind-altering revelations, this news really shouldn't have been so surprising after everything he just heard. But maybe it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Whatever, that didn't matter. His slightly shifted perception of Aizawa could wait. Okay, we should be able to work with that. I can't guarantee anything, but you should be able to take him home. They'll need to place him somewhere, and if a solution presents itself so readily, I can't imagine they'd pass it up at midnight on a Thursday. They're going to want to go home just as much as you. If all else fails, we can claim it's a safety measure after everything that happened with the USJ. Ultimately, it's up to the social worker where he's placed, but staying with you is a logical argument, especially if that's what Midoriya wants as well. The crease in Aizawa's brow deepened at his last remark. Was Midoriya already unwilling to be there? Did he actually kidnap the kid? Aizawa, do you think he'll want to stay with you? He doesn't have the final choice, but if he doesn't want to be there, that will certainly sway the social worker to at least look for alternative placements, he warned. I have no idea what he wants. He's not speaking to me, he admitted. Now Masa couldn't imagine what was going through the kid's head right now. His whole world just came crashing down around him. He probably didn't even know what he wanted, so it wasn't surprising that Aizawa didn't either. Right. Well, try and work this out with him, but the plan needs to stay in place unless you want a kidnapping charge on your record. He'll cooperate that much, right? He asked hopefully. Yes, I'm sure he'd do whatever I asked him to. Whether or not that's what he wants is another question entirely. That response left him with 1,000 more questions than before, but now wasn't the time. So he dumped them on top of the infinite pile of questions that tonight's revelations had provoked and vowed to save those for another day. I will need to be debriefed on all of Ivy's escapades, both on and off the record, so that I know what I need to be covering up. However, that can wait for another time. I implore both of you to make a report of events for me to go over at a later date. We have a solid plan of action for now. Is there anything else that needs to be discussed, gentlemen? Nedzu asked. Now Masa couldn't think of anything else, at least not anything that he wanted to discuss in front of Aizawa. There was probably something they ought to talk about, but his brain was far too scrambled to analyze the situation properly right now, so he shook his head. The moment everyone confirmed there was nothing more to discuss, Aizawa hastily took his leave, likely to get back and debrief Yamada and Midoriya about everything. As he left and shut the door behind him, now Masa looked back to Nedzu. He doesn't know, right? He asked. No, he does not, Nedzu confirmed. He's going to find out, Naomasa stated as a matter of fact. Yes, yes, I imagine that he will, Nedzu responded. Should we tell him? No, I don't think it's our place to make that call. The only part of it that might pertain to this investigation is the boy's recently changed quirk status, and that is in his file. We can direct him toward Yagi if or when he has questions about that. Now Masa cringed at that. He would not want to be in Toshinori's shoes when Aizawa found out the truth. We should warn him, he asserted. How are we supposed to warn him without disclosing Midoriya's personal information? He went to great lengths to hide all of this from us, and I doubt he'd take kindly to us spilling the proverbial beans to his mentor. He's going to find out eventually, he argued. Yes, I imagine that he will. Nedzu responded again, steepling his paws under his chin in thought. So what? We're just going to sit around and see who starts asking questions first? He asked incredulously. We legally have no right to alert Yagi to the situation, and morally, it's not our secret to tell Aizawa. So, yes, unfortunately, that is the option we are left with. Oh, this was going to be a shit show, but Nedzu was right. It was going to be a shit show regardless of what they did, so they may as well not violate anyone's trust in the process. I could suggest that he tell Aizawa for the sake of the kid's education. Midoriya is pretty much all he ever talks about. It wouldn't be out of place to slip the idea into a conversation, he mused. The rodent thought on that for a moment before responding. How likely do you think he would be to take your advice? I don't know, but it wouldn't hurt to try, right? It could, but if you trust your ability to suggest that without further questioning, then I don't see the harm, Nedzu conceded. He scrubbed his hands across his face, took a deep breath before speaking. It's worth a shot. End of chapter.